Hi there, everybody. We are a couple of minutes after 1 o'clock, and we welcome you to the ACSA Legislative Lunch Break on a Wednesday, along with Edgar Zasweta, ACSA's Senior Director of Policy and Governmental Relations. I'm Naj Edgar, ACSA's Senior Director of Marketing and Communications. Welcome. Join our chat, join our conversation today. Say hello. Let us know where you're at, your region, what's happening in your school district. Edgar, how are you today?
Hey, I'm just distracted by the jacket, Naj. I don't know if I could say anything else. I guess I'm doing well, but you came big. That's all I got to say.
We were challenged at the end of last week's show by Terry Rufert, the superintendent over in Sundale Union Elementary School District, to show up with some type of festive gear. And I pulled this thing out. Charlie Hoffman just said, that jacket, oh my. You know what? When Charlie's coming in and he's got some comments, you know Charlie's going to have some good comments for us. Hey, we got a big show today. We've got to talk about some youth sports guidelines that came out earlier this week. We've also got the great Assemblymember Phil Ting on today to talk about Assembly Bill 10, the proposed legislation to reopen schools this spring. Edgar, let's go ahead and talk youth sports guidelines. We had expected these guidelines to come out before Thanksgiving. They came out this week. It's very similar to what we had heard previously about a tier structure, very similar to the blueprint for a safer economy. We have everything broken down into outdoor low contact, outdoor moderate contact, moderate tier, and then minimal tier. Something that's important for all of our viewers to know: basketball, football, soccer, volleyball, all in orange. We know, Edgar, from our discussions, we know CIF had been working with the governor's office, with CDPH on these guidelines. Your impression as this information is filtered out?
Yeah, I have to remember that for a large part of our membership, whatnot, some folks may have just be seeing this for the first time. We had an inkling for some weeks and months. I think we had talked about some of the things that we were expecting. It was pretty consistent with that. I think the first and foremost, I think we have to applaud CDPH and the governor's office for finally putting something out. I know that was an area of consternation, to say the least, for a lot of our educators or a lot of our folks who are trying to respond to parent inquiries. So if nothing else, now we have a roadmap. We have a roadmap of what it will take to get kids back into some of these activities. The flip side of that is that given the current state of affairs with our COVID situation, for most sports, notwithstanding a lot of the individual sports that will be allowed in purple, it's going to be a while. It's going to be a while until kids are able to play baseball, softball, soccer, basketball, as you mentioned. But if nothing else, we at least have a pathway. The one other negative is that it's now maybe a reality that for some of our students, they may be hard pressed to get a season in this academic year.
Yeah, no, I agree with you. Hello to Mark and to John, Tim, Angela, our loyal viewer, on with us today. Susan, Muhammad Warad. Good to see all of you with us today. And folks, we'll talk a little bit more about the youth sports guidelines a little bit later on in the show. If you have questions about that, stay with us for that. And I bring that up because today, of course, is National Signing Day for high school seniors who want to go and play collegiate athletics. So we'll talk a little bit more about that. And if you have questions, go ahead and drop those in the chat. Let's go ahead and talk about Assembly Bill 10. This is the proposed legislation that would reopen schools in the spring. Joining us today is Phil Ting, the Assembly member from the 19th District, covering portions of San Francisco and San Mateo County. Mr. Assemblyman, thank you so much for being with us today. It's an honor to have you.
Thanks for having me on. I wish I knew I should have brought my own sunglasses. I have to get warned.
Exactly. Hey, let me ask you, there's this coalition of lawmakers who've decided to take a more active role in the reopening school effort. So the first question we would ask is, can you give us an idea of what the legislative effort looks like right now and what the package of Assembly Bill 10 looks like?
Yeah, absolutely. The legislative bill is actually very, very simple. Assembly Bill 10 just requires all LEAs to publicly adopt a plan to safely reopen. That's implemented within 2 weeks of public health allowance, which is the red tier or below, and it obviously has to meet state safety guidelines. It also requires the LEAs to identify students that are struggling under 100% distance learning and to bring those back for a minimum of 50% of instructional minutes each week as part of a tiered re-engagement plan. It also allows distance learning on an individual basis for vulnerable or quarantined certified employees. So we want to make sure that we protect our vulnerable employees too. But more importantly, it's also part of a public health request that we are asking for from the administration. We've been working to ask the administration for clear public health requirements, to revise the public health tiers for schools, also to ensure that there is strong small cohort re-engagement, that there's better data, that we also know what the vaccine plan is, as well as the testing and PPE plans. And so we have a public health package that we've also requested that is part of AB 10. That didn't go in a bill, they just went in terms of a letter going to DPH and to the administration.
Assembly members, so you just noted, and I'm happy to hear that. And I know that will be music to some of the ears of our members who have been looking, frankly, for the state and the governor's office to maybe take a little bit more proactive role in terms of what are those guidelines, what is the direction we're seeing from the state. And so you mentioned a letter to the governor and to Dr. Galley. Any early indications about what we may see, if we'll get a response, and do you see their approach maybe changing on how they deal with the school reopening issue based on your discussions?
Well, it's clear that in my discussions with Dr. Ghali and Dr. Pond, that they firmly believe that schools can safely reopen. There is a way to do it. And so that was reassuring to me, that otherwise I wouldn't have introduced AB 10. Also, what we're trying to encourage them is at this point, they've sort of given guidance and kind of left it up to all the school administrators to say, hey, here's kind of like guidance, but no set direction. So we really want them to narrow the guidance to give much clearer direction and more specific direction, because that's what we've been hearing is missing. Because then, as we all know, school districts don't have their own public health officers. They can't sit and figure out all the different public health guidelines, and the guidelines continue to change. But what districts can do is work with their employees to have a public health safety plan, and I think that's important. That's very, very critical. Now, I think we did our part where every district now has got 2 months of PPE, and then in addition, we want to make sure there's adequate testing and potentially vaccines when the vaccines are starting to get rolled out in larger numbers. But again, I think we really want to push public health to be much more directive than kind of giving everybody a buffet menu of what to choose from, because I think that's creating a lot of confusion.
And folks, we want to remind you, if you have questions or comments for Assemblymember Ting, he is only with us today briefly. So go ahead and join in on the chat and submit those for us. Every time we talk about school reopenings here, Assemblyman, we always have to bring up our labor partners and the welcoming of new efforts. Has there been any initial reaction to these initial efforts by you and your team on AB 10?
Yeah, the reaction has been that the labor partners are very supportive in concept. Obviously, everything, as we know, at an education level is, down to the details. Details matter, but they have been very supportive in terms of our efforts in trying to highlight how schools could reopen, as well as to push the administration on the different public health questions that really need to happen.
Assemblymember, one of the things that we also been talking a lot about here on the show is we've had different guests, is reminding the distinction that even when the state sets guidelines, that the county public health has the authority to go and sometimes deviate from that. And we've seen some examples. So kind of the intent, Angelo, one of our regular viewers asked, what would local county public health's mandate? Would that be tied directly to AB 10? So if the state does have now some guidelines on when schools should reopen, how do we reconcile that with sometimes we're getting a little bit different direction from local public health?
Right. Well, I think, I don't know that unless there's some sort of extraordinary tier that we're not aware of. In purple, obviously, you still need to get approval from local public health. But in terms of red, orange, and yellow, unless for some reason public health is stopping the opening of schools, I don't know that public health would impact this particular decision. Now, I think it's important for districts to be working with their public health departments and vice versa, for the public health departments to be working with their districts. It's a little bit easier in San Francisco because there's only one public health department in one district. But I know for San Mateo County, that's not the case. You have a lot more districts, and it's much more challenging.
We have a question that's come in from Gary Reller, who's the principal over at Matthew Gage Middle School in Riverside Unified School District. We're going to talk about Gary a little bit later on in the show as well. He asked the question, what do you think the chances are to get a 2/3 vote? If I remember correctly from the details, this would be emergency legislation and require a 2/3 approval. Is that correct? And where do you see that right now?
Yeah, the legislation has an urgency clause, and I think it's very likely that we could get a 2/3 vote. I think there's broad bipartisan agreement to try to get schools open and obviously try to do it safely. And I'm seeing there's another question about, is this only K-6? No, it's K-12. The bill would impact K-12.
Assemblymember, one of the things, obviously, you have a unique role in the legislative process as the budget chair, and I know this is something you've been keeping an eye on, even at the beginning of COVID and what was happening with schools. So, based on, obviously, we got some good news from the LAO, and we're thinking that there may be some more resources. I know you have to wait to respond to what the governor presents, but just even coming from the Assembly's priorities, how do you see the budget playing out? And connected to, especially on the education side, connected to some of these broader efforts?
Yeah, I think right now we have some additional resources that are one time. So I think the question is whether or not we pay off the deferrals that we owe all the districts this year, or whether we hold off on that and potentially do additional funding for this next year. So I think that's what we'll be debating and discussing. But so far, the news is good for this current budget year and not so good for budget years after that.
We have had a lot of news this week as far as the vaccines are concerned. Obviously, the vaccines made it here into California. A lot of the questions are about, where do educators fall as far as that tier is concerned? We know, first responders are there. We know that some of our most vulnerable have their tier. Where do you see educators right now as far as that line of vaccinations?
Yeah, at this point, I haven't been part of those discussions. I think they've been primarily discussed through the public health department. But obviously, I would support having educators and people who work in public schools to be very high up on that list, no question.
Assemblymember, one of the things that, on that note, going back to budget, that we've been hearing a lot about, that obviously there's the things that we've been thinking a lot about, the PPE and COVID testing. And I think even as we enter into a new school year, there will be a big push on some of those issues. The one issue, we can't go into a group of administrators without hearing something about social emotional health of students and staff, for that matter, that our teachers, our school leaders have had a lot of struggles. Do you see that being also part of the discussions as we're thinking about reopening and dedicating resources? And we hear a lot about learning loss. I think we constantly get asked about this social emotional learning. And any thoughts on that?
Yeah, behavioral health is a huge issue right now, not just in schools, but throughout California. It's becoming a big problem. It was a big problem before. It's become even bigger and more exacerbated by COVID. That's what we've seen. COVID didn't introduce any new issues. COVID just has exacerbated every issue that we knew was out there. We talked about equity issues. We talked about learning loss. We talked about the achievement gap. All those issues were things that we talked about last year, but COVID exacerbated all of them. So in terms of behavioral health, we do absolutely know it's an issue. At this point, the governor proposed a new proposal last year around behavioral health that I think he's going to bring back forward, and we're going to be digging into that and seeing how we can improve it and if we're going to agree to it.
You know what, Assemblymember, let me ask you this final question. We heard from Austin Butner, the superintendent from LA Unified, last week when they talked about having to do a hard shutdown of schools in that community. And part of his discussion, part of his messaging was the importance of schools and the role they play in being able to get vaccinations out to their communities. Are you hearing anything inside the Capitol about having schools, school sites, campuses be a place where vaccinations take place?
Yeah, again, I haven't been part of those discussions, so I have not heard. And again, so I don't have any vaccine update. What I would say is, for us, this group of legislators that's talking about school reopening, we all believe that schools should be reopened when our doctors tell us they can be reopened safely. And I think that's what we're trusting. We're not listening to public opinion. We're not even thinking about our personal feelings. It's absolutely 100% based on what the public health professionals at the counties and at the state level say. When is it safe? How is it safe? And I think if you look back at New York City is a great example. There's not a bigger district, and there's not a more pro-union town than New York City. And they found a way to get schools reopened. And again, they only closed because they had that threshold of 3%. But again, even though they opened, you saw really the mood change. You saw teachers who were very nervous about going back to school, just be happy to be back in school. You didn't see a huge spike in transmission. And so for me, New York City gives me hope, because I can't imagine a more complex or a larger system or a place where the politics are more complicated. So again, that was a great touchstone for me to see those schools kind of reopen, close, and now start to partially reopen again.
Assemblymember Phil Ting, the great assembly member from the 19th District covering San Francisco and San Mateo County. Thank you, sir, very much for being with us today. It's been an honor to have you. Happy holidays to you and your family.
Happy holidays. Thanks so much for having me on. Take care.
For coming on.
Take care. Thank you. There we go. Assemblymember Phil Ting talking about the proposed legislation, Edgar, Assembly Bill 10 to reopen schools in the spring. And we've had so many comments coming in and out over here on our chat. Anything, Edgar, that stuck out for you just in hearing what Phil Ting had to say comments-wise about AB 10?
Yeah, I think that my first takeaway is that this is a much broader effort than them even just introducing a bill, right? Or a series of bills. And I think, as he pointed out, it's a package. And to their credit, there's this group of legislators who are seeing, and they're assessing this situation not only from their respective legislative districts. I know a number of them are parents themselves, right? So are seeing firsthand, how distance learning is going, maybe some of the challenges, hearing from different stakeholders about some of the equity issues. And I think it's interesting. It's interesting that they are putting themselves out there and asking the state to take a more deliberate approach. I think aside from AB 10 and some of the companion bills that the Assembly member talked about, I think this notion of putting some pressure on the governor's office to kind of change tracks. What we've been hearing and seeing on our chats for months now, it's hearing from communities that it needs to go beyond just telling us when we can open or when it's safe, but maybe setting some clear guidelines that under these circumstances, maybe the state does need to be a little more directive. So that definitely seems to be one of the major takeaways in terms of their priorities and their efforts.
Let me ask you, since Phil has left the show, he had another meeting that he had to get to. I'm going to rely on your experience inside the state capitol, because he talked about this is urgency legislation. He felt confident about the 2/3 vote. Can you talk a little bit about what a 2/3 vote, what an urgency bill looks like? Because Nancy Nauman asked the question, is there a timeline for the bill? From your experience inside the Capitol, can you give us some definition on what all of this means?
Yeah, so I think the first thing is that they're going to prioritize this, given that this is an urgency and that this appears to have the backing of some of their legislative leadership. I would not be surprised if they try to fast track some of these efforts early in the legislative session. But typically, the legislative session has officially started as of last week. They'll be coming back, and we'll be back in Sacramento come the beginning of January. So their intent is to pass this. In a typical year, when something gets passed, it doesn't become law usually until the following year, January 1st of the following year, unless the bill dictates otherwise. Oftentimes with budget bills and other fiscal items, they'll start or become effective at the beginning of the fiscal year. What this bill says is they want it to go into place starting March. So assuming all of this happens, right, that they pass it, that they get 2/3 of both houses of the legislature, get the governor to sign it, then it would go effect in March. So hence, if some communities, if their tier status does start to change after we get past the surge, we could see this bill go into effect. Having said all that, and I think we talked a little bit about this last week, and this is, I'll put my political analyst hat on here, play my best, pretend I'm on CNN. One of the pieces that I could see happening is their efforts may not ever become law. Like, this could be that the bill never gets signed by the governor, but the pressure, the political pressure, or just the fact that you had a significant contingent of the assembly and the legislature pushing in this direction, the governor could take some of this and now change their guidelines, right? Whether it be through executive orders or just modifying the health guidelines we have in place. It would be a little unclear what part of that would require changes in law, what part of that could be done just through the governor's office. So all that to say is I expect what this group of legislators are pushing is going to have ramifications, not just on whether we change ed code, but potentially on what's the governor's stance on some of this. I think we'll see the administration respond to it one way or another in the coming weeks and months.
Well, I think that if anybody was to look at their social media feeds, there are plenty of people who are screaming and yelling, because that's what social media is there for, about getting the students back in school, what they're seeing in other communities. I assume that there's a lot of political pressure and discussion that's happening among the lawmakers, because you do have some areas. I saw Don Austin from Palo Alto Unified. He's had schools open. He's had students there. Michelle Eklund, who's my counterpart over in Placer County, they have schools open. There were some decisions there kind of going back and forth about in-person education after the first of the year in Roseville. So I just wonder, Edgar, because you have these discussions, how much is the feedback going to influence politics inside the Capitol when it comes to something like AB 10 and what comes after it?
Oh, I think it's going to have a significant factor. I think, if anything, the legislators are already responding to some of the community pressure they're hearing and feeling from parents, from other community members, from some of our members, that they need some support, that they need some help. And I think this is an outshoot of this. I do think that whether it be our members or our communities, should they have perspectives on this, I think on this broader issue of having the state push a little bit harder, I think that will have an impact. Now, with that said, there's going to be parts of this that we're going to maybe want to modify. There's always the devil's in the details, right? In terms of how this is going to look and making sure that it doesn't have unintended consequences, that it takes unique community situations or circumstances into account. So us at ACSA will definitely be on the lookout for that. But I do think that hearing from members and community and parents is always important, especially on an issue like this.
Hey, Edgar, let me ask you this one other question, because Mary Lim puts in the comments here, availability of free testing and receiving results quickly is very uneven throughout the counties. How much is that testing discussion going to carry over through the holidays and into that first part of January, especially as we move towards the governor's budget proposal in mid-January?
Yeah, in many ways, it's unfortunate that we're still having this conversation, right, about testing capacity, given that we're 9+ months into the pandemic. And if anything, the state has doubled capacity, where a few weeks ago we were talking about averaging about 150,000 COVID tests a day. I think the state is doubling that now. But yet, as we've been hearing from our members, that still doesn't mean that every community has enough resources to test as much as they want or as much as it requires, given the local health situation. I think, to your question, yes, I think this will continue to be a big topic of discussion. I know we are still anticipating, I think I said this last week, I don't know if it'll happen before the holiday, but I do believe that at some point CDPH will have more to say on the testing front. And I think one thing to make our members aware of, there could be some changes on the guidelines on how often we should be testing. Now, to that point, one of the things that makes us a little nervous, it's one thing for the state to say, you should test more often, you should test weekly. Do we actually have the resources to do that? And I think that's where we'll be looking for even more support from the state. Things are changing on that front, not just only with the vaccines. I was listening today and reading that there's a new rapid at-home test, right? So the landscape on COVID testing has changed. I still feel as it comes to supporting our schools, we're still a little bit behind. So that'll be something that ACSA continues to push on.
Edgar, let me just go back really quickly to the youth sports guidelines because they are so impactful, and you and I are soccer coaches. And so what we were seeing out of there was definitely impactful for the work that you and I are doing on the soccer field. But I do want to ask this question, and I know there probably isn't a good answer for it at this point, but it is National Signing Day today. This is the day that seniors sign their letters of intent if they're going to go play a collegiate sport next year. And for juniors, this is the year where they have heavy recruiting going on. And for the juniors that aren't there right now, it's definitely an impact if we don't see seasons this year, if people can't get into those other tiers. Is there any discussion right now that you're hearing about athletics and National Signing Day and anything as far as athletics beyond the youth sports guidelines?
Yeah, no, that's a good question. I mean, there's ramifications across the board. Obviously, we think about those students that may have the option to go play at the next level. And then we also think about the students at the other end of the spectrum who sports, and I would say other extracurricular activities are the thing that keeps them connected to their school and to their academics. So I think to answer your question, I don't know that there's a ton movement. Here's one of the challenges with COVID. Even as we look state by state, every state has its own guidelines. So it's an uneven playing field. I think one of the unintended consequences of some of the lack of guidance on youth sports, as we saw, there was teams traveling to other states, high school players transferring to other schools in other states to get one more shot at that scholarship. So hopefully now the state setting a roadmap will help not only on the health situation, maybe discourage some of those students and teams from going elsewhere. But again, knowing in full well that even with the guidelines, for many of our students, they're going to have to wait a while to get back on the field or get back to their regular activities, even if it's not sports.
Yeah, I hear that. Folks, our Every Child Counts Symposium, February 3rd and 4th. This is our virtual 2021 Every Child Counts Symposium. This is ACSA's largest conference that we do. It's designed for beginning and veteran educational leaders and focused on the latest in the field of student services and special education. We have a preview of the 2021 virtual ACSA ECC conference. Take a look. And that is the 2021 Every Child Counts Symposium, February 3rd and 4th. You can register now at ACSA.org. Right on the front page, you will see that photo right there. You go ahead and click that and you can register ACSA.org for registration, the 2021 virtual Every Child Counts Symposium. I do also want to tell you folks, we don't have an ACSA campus tour tomorrow. For those of you who normally watch, that's our one-on-one interview with a district administrator about what's happening in their school community. But last week, we spoke with Gary Reller. We talked about Gary earlier. He's a loyal viewer. He's the principal at Matthew Gage Middle School in the Riverside Unified School District. Watch this edition of the campus tour, and I challenge you to watch the final 90 seconds of it and don't think that this is a huge student advocate that you are seeing. And he has an unbelievable way of keeping his school community connected. Again, I challenge you, Edgar, to watch the last 90 seconds of it. It left me in absolute laughter like I have never experienced. It was good. It was good.
You make everything sound good, but after that, I don't know how we could resist. So I'm going to take the invitation.
You're already here, folks. So as soon as you're done listening to Edgar and I talk, go ahead and watch that. Hey, we do also want to say thank you to all of our viewers who have been with us. This is show number 26. I did the math yesterday, Edgar, only because our board report is due. Don't forget, board report content is due. This is the 26th episode of this show. So thank you so much. And we do want to bring one more person on, unless we can get both of them to come on. Gianna Miller is our social media whiz. She is on top of what's happening here with the chat. And Michael Kelly, who's probably going to be shy. He's our executive producer, and he doesn't want to jump on. Gianna, we just want to get Michael. We're not going to get Michael.
He controls the monitor, so we can't make him come on.
Yeah, I can say hello this way, can I?
Hey, I just want to ask both of you, because Michael has said this to us after every show over the last month, because we literally tell him about an hour before of what the show is going to look like. Gianna and Michael, you guys are involved with the members throughout this. I would leave you guys to just share a couple of comments. Gianna, since you're on screen first, you get to talk first.
Oh, great. Well, first I want to show off my sweater, which is like kind of a Mrs. Claus sweater.
I like
that. Yeah, that's one of my favorites. I have loved chatting with the members. Thank you, all of you who've been chatting with me. I've been the one putting the little silly comments and jokes the whole time, calling out Muhammad Warad every week, one of my hobbies. I just love seeing you all every week. All the regulars, all the new names, see how fast you are with the like button. Gary Reller, almost every week, Gary Reller or Scott Smith are the first ones. So I have to say, it's impressive.
And Michael, a couple of comments from you.
Look, I figured everybody's going to get enough of you and me over the next couple of conferences. So why do I need to show my face on camera yet another time? We'll save that for negotiators and obviously the Superintendent Symposium and Every Child Counts. Not to mention Legislative Action Day. So get ready for that in April. You're going to see a lot of Naj and me. I apologize to everybody in advance. But look, as we've talked about this time and time again, ACSA is a family, right? And it is this great network. And we talk to administrators all the time who say that this can be a lonely job. And so I think every Wednesday for 30 minutes or 45 minutes or an hour sometimes to be able to come together in this format. I've been at ACSA for 5 years now. I've never seen anything like. I think it's a sign of the times, but it shows the power of ACSA, and it shows the power of our members who are just time and time again wanting up to the minute information on how to serve their students in the best way possible, and that's why I love working for ACSA.
Thanks, Michael. Radio only Michael Kelly from our studio back there with that.
Holly's asking for my sweater. I don't have one.
I know. Yeah. And for some reason, I just don't think we're going to see it, which is too bad. All right, Michael, Gianna, thanks so much for sharing some final words with everybody. Edgar, it certainly has been an absolute pleasure to do this with you. Folks, if you want to mark your calendar, he and I are back January 6th with our first edition of the ACSA Legislative Lunch Break of 2021 as we get ready for the governor's budget proposal. At that time, we're going to see, Edgar, how things evolve with COVID post-Christmas. I'm keeping my fingers crossed that things improve because I know the athletes definitely want to get out there. I know that the students want back in school, and fingers crossed, right?
Oh, yeah. I mean, and first of all, so 26, I'm glad you counted. I lost track of how many. So this has been such a pleasure. I mean, just to be able to connect with our members on a weekly basis. And we say this all the time. It's a privilege. It's a responsibility to work for ACSA, not just because of my day job as a parent. I see what's happening in our schools. I see how much our education leaders are just trying to do right by our kids. So we're happy that we're able to help and maybe give a little bit of that information. So we'll keep this thing going as long as people tune in. I look forward, like everybody else. 2021 can't be much worse. So I look for better things in the new year.
Yeah, absolutely. Edgar, good seeing you today.
As always, Naj. See you next time.
And thank you folks so much for joining us here on the ACSA Legislative Lunch Break. Again, go ahead and mark your calendar. We are back January 6th with our first edition of 2021. Have a great rest of the week. Happy holidays to you.